My name is Anton. I'm a professor of pharmacoepidemiology at the University of Southern Denmark and Odense University Hospital. For the next just short of 30 minutes, I'll tell you some of the tricks and the processes that we have in our group established over the last 5 or 7 years regarding saying no. That is, how to turn down new project ideas, how to disregard new ideas you have yourself, or how to say no to new collaborations. That's of course not to say it's just no for the sake of saying no. Rather, it is tools that we are now using to prioritize, to make sure that the projects that we engage in are the right projects, are the projects most important to us and to what we want to achieve long term. We've been doing this for quite a while, and we have framed this differently over time, but one of the more sort of important framings, I think, is the art of saying no. That is, we would like to elevate saying no from a thing you should probably do more often and that we often talk about, but figure it out for yourself, to an art form, a craft, something that we are proud of doing well, something that we know how to do and that we have established tools for doing. Originally, this project came about after an internal seminar where a colleague of mine gave a presentation entitled "An Idea is Born." How to come up with new ideas, where does the inspiration come from, all the new hypotheses. And I then had to give the second half, which I entitled "An Idea Dies," that is, how to select which ones of these very many new ideas that should be killed off initially and rather which to prioritize. So I'll go through some of the sort of tricks that we've established following from that talk very many years ago. Before doing that, I know it's important to emphasize what the overarching aim here is, because it can come off as us simply trying to say no and do less. But it is very far from the truth. The reason why we want to say no and why me and my colleagues often talk about how to say no and what to say no to is the fact that we would like our work and our effort to matter. We'd like to make sure that what we are doing actually have an impact. And it is so easy to be caught up in projects left and right, elegantly described here with this cartoon from Lancet from very many years ago on random medical news. As I'm from health science, twins causes depression or coffee causes depression in twins, or some other news. One day a new story, a new hypothesis being proved. But is it true, and how will this actually change something? It's easy to become caught up in the wheels of science, just doing more and more, pursuing all the hypotheses that your data allows you to pursue. But we would like to take it back a bit and prioritize so that we can get closer to this wonderful quote by Doug Altman, a British statistician. And we need less research, we need better research, and we need research done for the right reasons. And the overarching ambition with doing our prioritization work, saying no more often, is for us to push ourselves towards this quote. And as I will get back to towards the end, I'm very certain this has helped us enormously in that regard. So it's not just saying no for the sake of saying no. It's because we want to make sure we do the right things for the most impact, instead of doing things that we, in hindsight, realize we should not have spent our time doing. We often talk about being too busy, overburdened, there's too much to do. We rarely talk about explicitly why that's a bad thing. Something with stress is typically sort of an implicit thing, but why is this a bad thing? This is of course highly individualized, but for me personally, I have a top 5 here. It's not in a particular prioritized order, just 5 out of many examples as to why I don't like being too busy. First off, it's not efficient. I am not efficient when I am too busy. As the donkey here, I will not be able to touch ground and actually do some work. I will jump from one project to another before actually getting into the subject matter, before actually making an effort or actually making progress. and thus I end up doing less if I have too much to do. A second reason is that we are all, at least most of us, also part of other systems and organizations than just our work. For instance, I have 3 kids and a wonderful wife, and I don't necessarily mind coming home late, at least if I can, with a straight face, say that what I did was important. But if it's just me getting caught up in something, not being able to say no, not actually having spent time away from them doing something that did contribute to something else, then it's too busy and it's too much. Then there's these two. This is Morten Schmidt and Shirley Wang. They are wonderful researchers based out of Aarhus University and Harvard University. These two wonderfully bright people are someone I look up to a lot. I would like to be in a position where I can keep up with these guys, but they are born into bigger institutions than I am, and they are no doubt much brighter and more hardworking than I am. If I am to keep up with them, that is, if I am to put myself in a position where I can collaborate and play with these wonderful, strong researchers, I need to prioritize my stuff. If I simply try to outrun them, I will surely lose. So I need to make sure I do the right things so I can keep up with these researchers. Luckily, I think that's one of the benefits here. I am very fortunate to have collaborations with both of these. Then there's my PhD students, or here just randomly the first 6 PhD students I've had. I am, as a supervisor or mentor for young researchers, I'm responsible for making sure they learn how to prioritize. Not just for the sake of the group and our output and our scientific capacity, but most certainly also because they are in a position in their career where actual tools to help them prioritize will protect them in a fairly vulnerable position from being overburdened, and hopefully also bring them tools that they can bring along for their later career in order to make sure they have a reasonable work-life balance and achieve what they would like to achieve. So in particular, as a mentor, as a supervisor, it's so important to have this explicit instead of implicit. And finally, I am sick and tired of what we internally refer to as partly shaved goats. I could not find a goat, so here's a picture of a sheep. But anyway, partly shaved goats refer to projects that you look back at a year or two later and realize that had I had the time, then to actually complete this important project, which I should have prioritized higher than I did, it would have become better. It's perhaps published in a semi-nice journal, but it could have gone into a very nice journal. It's perhaps published okay, but I never took the time to disseminate the finding to the real stakeholders, so it never really got out there and made a difference. Partly shaved goats, that is, I'm too busy to make the last push for a given project, and thus I have to live with a bunch of projects standing like they were almost completed, but not fully. Okay, final meta comment before we get down to the actual business is, of course, the question of when. You could argue that prioritization game is much more important to the senior researcher with a full portfolio and many different projects coming in. And no doubt, it's also more important in that capacity than in previous roles that you can play through in your career. However, I will argue that you need to do this, or need to learn how to do this, much, much sooner than that. Clearly, you should probably not show up for your first ever job, first ever day with your first ever boss telling you what to do and argue that you should probably prefer saying no to that task. Fair enough. But for instance, in the context of a PhD student, around the second year or at least third year of studies, you should probably start doing this, both because you need these tools to protect yourself against the often very many offers that start coming in at this point in time, but more importantly so that you have these tricks and these skills taught, you have learned these so that you know how to do it when you get to the potentially later stages of your research career or get to a different position where offers typically come at a much higher pace. So these are the 8 tools that I would like to go over. These are not based off literature or anything like. These are 8 very hands-on practical tools that me and my colleagues use very, very frequently. So, without further ado, let's get down to it. Taking the first criteria, the Mytgaard criteria. The Mytgaard criteria are named after Hans Mytgaard. He's a Danish jazz musician. Unfortunately, Hans cannot remember having worded these criteria. However, we've asked him, and he both finds them reasonable and fully consents to us having named them the Mytgaard criteria, which is, I think, reasonable because we are fairly certain he was the one to come up with them originally. The Mytgaard criteria are sort of born out of the music industry, and thus they are, briefly and elegantly put, as nice people, nice music, and nice pay. As a young musician, you would probably accept any gig wherever, playing any kind of music, to whomever, regardless of what you are paid, if anything at all. But as you accumulate experience, as you can allow yourself to make some demands, you should probably require at least 2 out of these 3 fulfilled. Either, for instance, cool people and cool music. It's okay you pay for free if it's with people you would like to play with and music that you find interesting. Or if we translate this into the academic industry, it's okay for you to do something that probably won't yield you a highly cited or much impactful or high impact factor paper and no grant money or the like, if it's interesting science that you do with people you would like to collaborate with. But you shouldn't do interesting science with people you don't like to collaborate with if there's no pay involved. Pay is the broadest term that can, for instance, talk about funding. It can be a matter of high impact publications or recognition or anything really a type of reward. Music refers to then science. Is this interesting science? Is this science you would like to become better at? New methods you can, anything really that gives you something in its own right from the subject matter. And nice people, of course, refer to whether this is people you would like to collaborate with. Having used this criteria a lot, it's probably the criteria we've used the most over the years. Having used it a lot, I've grown to realize that this is actually sort of a hidden test. The test here is, in fact, whether you are hinging all of your effort into this new project or idea on the single potential reward, which is very critical, large as that reward may be, since it might not come to fruition. If you do something with people you don't want to work with, that isn't interesting, but it will be published nicely, what do you then do when you have the paper rejected from the high impact journal? You are left with nothing. So you need to make sure this hinges on at least 2 rewards, 2 potential benefits to you. Otherwise, you should probably not do it. We use this criteria very sort of practically in our everyday lives. Someone sends me a new idea or a new proposal or a new hypothesis or a new collaboration, and I would then rate it. I can even use half points. Okay, nice people, 1 point, semi-interesting job here, half a point, no apparent funding or reward or high impact, anything, 0 points. That yields me 1.5. I'll then forward the idea to a colleague, they'll do the same thing, and if we agree that the score, either just both of our scores or something we negotiate afterwards, if the score we end up with falls below 2, the proposal is rejected. Very practical thing to use, very easy to use, having this sort of, I give it this, then that, what do you think? Let's not, if it falls below 2. And of course, when you on occasion see a Mytgaard 3 proposal, that is a proposal that both involves someone you like to work with, nice pay and nice, interesting music, science, you should pursue and prioritize that. Back to our list of tricks. The next tool is a small but sometimes very important tool that we refer to as the 72-hour rule, or rather, sleep on it. When you enter into a idea generation phase or have the idea generated but the idea refinement phase, you can, at least I can, at times become very enthusiastic. This idea is now being built on half actual content and idea, and half of it is just pure adrenaline. which is okay. You need adrenaline to develop and refine your ideas. But whenever I enter into such a project proposal refinement stage, and I can feel that there's adrenaline involved, I go through with the refinement, but then I have to sleep on it for 3 consecutive days. There's nothing that is ever that urgent. You can always wait 3 days. And once that idea is then put back in the drawer, 3 days has passed, you will take a new look at it. You will be able to see how much of this was actual value, actual content, and how much of the nicety of this project was born out of pure adrenaline. Sometimes you go back and say, okay, this is actually something I would really like to do. But surprisingly often, the idea you had 3 days ago, which was the best idea ever, now 3 days later seem like something you should probably not doing. At times I even sort of think, why was I ever enthusiastic about this idea? So whenever adrenaline is involved, and of particular importance, if you are good, as I am, at becoming too enthusiastic sometimes, sleep on it for 3 days and go back. Third criteria, tick box optimization. This is probably the tool that I nowadays use the most, previously Mytskov. Tick box optimization is a very simple yet very powerful tool. I sit down with my new idea and I think, how many issues, problems, challenges can I solve with the effort required to do this new proposal? Sometimes it's just the one. I have the proposal, I can complete the proposal, and then that's it. But sometimes there's more to it. Sometimes doing this proposal will also give me some funding, which might be practical because I have this person ideal for this task that is in need of additional funding. It could be a matter of this new proposal teaching me this method that I could then use for that other project. It could be a new proposal by a group I would really like to collaborate with longer term, so establishing that connection, etc., etc., etc. We are all busy people, and generally speaking, we cannot only solve one issue with one piece of effort. We need to make sure that whatever we do is sort of multiplied, handling different scenarios. Sometimes when I do this, an idea might have a wonderful high Mytskov criteria score. It might be the best idea ever. I have already slept on it for 3 days. But when I do my tick box thing, it seems like this idea is somewhat tangential to what I'm actually doing. It's an idea that is nice in its own right, but it only solves the one, and thus it sort of exists in the periphery of my full portfolio. And that is a warning sign here, because if something is not closely related to other challenges that you are facing, there's a very real risk that this proposal is somewhat of a satellite. There's no synergy with what you are doing in general. And thus, and I speak from unfortunate and very empirical data here, oftentimes such projects that exist in the periphery with no synergy, they end up becoming the projects that you are most frustrated about having entered into, because they sort of always seem to pop up at the most sort of unfortunate of times. More importantly, and the reason why I think I use this as much as I do now, is that this is not only a say yes or no tool, it's also an optimization tool. Having this analysis completed, I very often see additional ideas that could be implemented into a given project. Okay, we discussed this could be a PhD proposal, but actually thinking about it, changing it to a postdoc proposal might yet need funding for that idea, for that other collaboration, and this person actually is looking for a postdoc and might have a fit here. So ways of tweaking your project to allow for additional ticks. So if no ticks or few ticks, should simply say no. But if it's actually a few ticks, think about whether you can achieve even more ticks with changing the proposal. Sometimes even only small changes make a big impact in this context. So this was most of the very practical ones. Now getting to the slightly more philosophical ones. JOMO. JOMO is a tool I've taken from this book by the Danish philosopher Svend Brinkmann. This is his way of changing the idea of FOMO, fear of missing out, into joy of missing out, or JOMO. Fear of missing out is the idea of, if I say no to go to this party, I might simply miss out on something epic I should have attended. if I say no to this project idea, maybe they will end up winning the Nobel Prize for it. What do I know? I should probably, due to my FOMO, say yes. But Brinkmann's idea is trying to sort of reverse this process and instead say, I opted out and I will make sure to appreciate my opting out. I will have JOMO, joy of missing out. And from a very practical point of view, we use this as what we refer to as JOMO coffee. Whenever we say no to something, we book ourselves in our Outlook calendar a week later for just 5 or 10 minutes to have a cup of coffee that is spent contemplating how much JOMO is actually present, how glad I am that I, a week ago, said no to something. This has a built-in 72-hour rule, and typically if we end up saying no a week later, we are very certain and very much appreciate that we did say no back then. Clearly this does not help us say no because we already did, but it builds confidence and it creates a sort of atmosphere of the importance of saying no on occasion. And it's also a nice way of thinking about the stuff that you no longer have to do. Oh, the many papers I had to read had I done this or said yes. All the many meetings I had to go to, etc. I know people are using the JOMO coffee concept because quite often people are sending me an email at the end of that JOMO coffee saying I just enjoyed my JOMO coffee on this or that occasion. I very much appreciate those emails. Back to the list. We have the vision statement. You will, most often, with your colleagues, your department, your research team, or perhaps even yourself or your supervisor have come up with some sort of vision statement. This is just randomly the vision statement for the team that I'm running at the University of Southern Denmark, together with a research leader colleague, outlining what we would like to achieve with our pharmacoepi research group. Whenever I have an idea that I'm unsure of whether we should pursue, looking at the idea on a piece of paper and looking at our vision statement, it's often quite obvious whether this idea will pull us towards the vision or whether it doesn't really have any synergy or have any sort of value into the vision statement. The vision statement is typically something that is born out of quite a lot of effort. Either the group's vision statement, the department's vision statement, or your personal vision statement. If you don't have a personal vision statement, then at least have some words jotted down somewhere on what you would like to achieve with what you're doing, your career overall, your current position. If you are unsure whether to accept a new proposal or a new challenge, it's worthwhile considering whether doing this will bring you closer to your own vision, your own ambition. And if it doesn't, it's probably not worth pursuing. Out of respect for the amount of time that your group has spent doing this vision statement, or that you have spent yourself thinking about what's important to you, the sort of everyday version of you that needs to decide yes or no, out of respect for all the effort put into it, should probably make sure to at least have checked whether you are pulling in the right direction. Back to the list. Senior input. For me, this is something that I have sort of formulated out of input from seniors for very many different occasions in over very many different settings. In my line of research, there's a wonderful quote here, quote by a quote from Robert Platt, quoting Ken Rothman for saying, "I've never regretted saying no." Ken and Robert are two of the very sort of heavy hitters within my field of pharmacoepidemiology. But generally speaking, senior researchers, that is senior supervisors or heads of department, etc., generally speaking, they are much more prone to say no and to prioritize and to help you prioritize as a young researcher than you give them credit for. Young researchers will often feel like they're being pulled along, and sometimes, obviously, it is like that. But generally speaking, the push for doing more, saying yes to everything, is more of an inherent trait in a younger researcher than it is something that is explicitly formulated by a senior researcher. And seeking out senior advice for actually, is this something I should prioritize, when you've done your mid-score, when you've done your tick box, everything, and you're still uncertain, seek out a senior colleague. Would you say yes? Would you say no? Why? What have I missed here? And oftentimes, senior input will help you say no more so than say yes. To-do comparison, also a fairly practical thing. We're back to having the new idea written down on a piece of paper so that you can compare. Because the reality is that if you say no to this project, it's not like you're unsure what you should be doing tomorrow. You should probably do all the other things you've already said yes to doing. And you need to be at peace with the fact that if you say yes to this new proposal, what you've already said yes to will suffer at least slightly on that behalf. So when you have your new idea, before accepting, it's probably an idea to compare with my annual goals. What did I actually promise myself to achieve this year? What is all the other projects that I've said yes to? What is the list of ongoing things that I need to contribute to? And even what is the list of ideas I already said no to? The list of ideas that if I ever have the time, I would like to. Surprisingly often, a new idea seems very nice. But compared to what you've already said, prioritized, it's not as nice. And if it's not as nice as what you could be doing alternatively, it's probably worth saying no even altogether, or perhaps just add it to the list of something to consider in the future. Either because you might have more time, or because the tick box optimization setting might have changed and suddenly this idea makes more sense than it does now. If it isn't competitive, if the new idea is not better or more interesting in what you would alternatively be doing, you should probably say no. Finally, we need constant reminders. Having an idea of saying no, having the ambition to say no, needs to be integrated into your daily routines, needs to be integrated into how you go about evaluating new ideas. And thus, constant reminders might be a thing. This is a semi-old photo of my own desktop, and next to it there's a picture of my oldest daughter, at the time not very old, looking at me very sternly. And for me personally, this photo reminds me of thinking about prioritizing, since it feels like she's telling me on this photo, "Are you sure you know what you're doing, Dad?" Constant reminders could also be a handout or a small purple star put on your monitor. It could be the printout of these 8 tools that I'll show you in a little while. It could be on the lock screen of your smartphone, anything really. But something that will help you, in particular initially, to integrate all of these sort of principles into saying yes or no, since you tend to say yes very quickly before having the time to go back to these tools if you don't pay attention. So these are the 8 tools. 8 different tools, but all of these tools I use fairly frequently, in particular the mid-score criteria and the tick box optimization tool. And it's also tools that we've implemented so that most of my colleagues at least would recognize and use all of these. The tools are described in this LinkedIn article. There's a link below this video so that you can revisit all these. It's very briefly explained, and this also includes a printout version with very brief sort of bullets for each of these 8 tools that you can, for instance, use as your constant reminder. Have it sort of hung up at top of your screen, or just staple it to the forehead of your most busy colleague. Personally, I've used these tools for quite many years, and while it's very different to measure, I believe difficult to measure, I believe I have reduced my number of projects by about 50%. The question is, of course, then, what have I now then spent these 50% doing instead? Because, as I said initially, it's not just a matter of doing less. It's about doing the right things. So for me, having been involved myself in much fewer projects, this is mainly a matter of strategy time. I have more time to step back from the different projects and to think about whether our group and myself, am I going in the right direction? Am I doing this right? Or do I need new skills, something I need to prioritize differently? We are becoming much better at avoiding partly shaved goats, to the extent that instead of pursuing more and more projects, we stop and think, perhaps even put on hold for a week or two before going back and think, Is there anything more we can do here? We publish fewer papers, but we certainly see an increase in the impact factor and sort of the reach and the dissemination of the papers that we publish. So we have much fewer partly shaved goats left behind before, as compared to what we did before. Finally, dissemination is also a big priority. The fact that we do fewer projects also allows more time spent to disseminate this individual project, saying, okay, we have a new finding here, we need this to go to clinicians or policymakers or peers. There's something here you need to know about, or cite, or what do I know. Really, more time giving into sort of disseminating, we call this to curate our research, that is, take on the responsibility of not just leaving it as a newly published paper, that's it, but making sure the effort put into the paper is actually effort that is put out there and will make a difference. All of this, I can attest to, have no doubt pushed us towards the idea of doing less research, but better research that is methodologically more sound, more sort of thorough in our analysis, in our interpretation of our writing, and research done for the right reasons. That is, research that we typically a priori can argue this is something that will have an impact, not doing it for the sake of doing it, participating in the random medical news. We're doing it because this will have an impact. So we are no doubt much closer to Doug Altman's ideal sort of research environment now than we were before we prioritized saying no. These are the 8 tools. I hope they have resonated with you, at least to some extent. Some of them have either sounds useful, or hopefully some or all of them will prove useful when you try to implement this. These are my contact information. I will surely appreciate if you reached out and told me how you've used this, or even just alert me of other tips and tricks how to prioritize. Thank you for listening.